Okay, good evening, everyone. Lovely to see all of you here on a Saturday evening. I promise you we've saved the best presentations for the last, so do stay tuned in completely. We're just, in the interest of time, because we're running a little late, I'm just going to get started with the panelists. We're going to have 12 minutes per person, and please keep an eye out on the time. Yeah, you can get started. So the first presentation we have is Creation of the Other in the Urban Discourse, a case study of Kochi city in Kerala.
Thank you. It's a privilege. Thank you, IIHS, for providing me an opportunity to present the study titled Creation of the Other in Urban Discourse, a case study on the Kochi city. This is co-authored with my supervisor, Dr. Rajib Shutrada. The outline of my presentation would be laying down a context on what Kochi city is all about, the projected population, which basically brings about a constriction of space by 2031, the research question, conceptual framework, data and methods, results and discussions, followed by conclusion. So the context is Kochi was a very colonial city ruled by the Portuguese, followed by the Dutch, and finally the British, and it was harbored by the British capitalists, engineers, bureaucrats who planned, designed, and took control over the space of Kochi, where the actual urban transition happened both in terms of space and capital. So the census 2011 shows Kochi as an urban agglomeration coming under the million-plus city. And also the population of Kochi is 21,19,724. And the annual entry of migrants on the basis of a study conducted by the Gulati Institute says that 1,82,000 migrants are expected. And for your kind information, Kochi houses the most amount of migrants in the state of Kerala. So this is the projected population, and you can see by 2031, it's going to be 22,73,512. So when there is an emergence of so much people, the urban space of Kochi itself is consumed in multifarious ways. Just like when we open the door, or when we open the window and see another building in Bangalore, perhaps that's the situation that's going to encounter for Kochi people as well. So the research question is, who belongs to the city? Whom does the city belong to? Is there a construction of the other in the city? If so, do the others actually feel so? So the framework largely looks into the concept of placemaking and how identity formation happens. So while space in itself refers to the functional physical space, place forms a concept of space in a relational sense as the location of social practices of different stakeholders. So the spatial expansions and the delineations are a paradigmatic difference that brings about to the urban space. Also with labeling identities, both in terms of labor and the localities, when I say labeling identities, both in terms of migrants and the natives, how the natives perceive the migrants and how the migrants perceive the natives. So the data, it was a very purely qualitative study. The voices were recorded. Few of them did not allow me to record their voices, so I wrote it down later. It was gig and platform workers, auto rickshaw drivers, petty producers, migrant and informal workers, small and medium scale agencies, IT employees, and field experts, which included the Greater Cochin Development Authority, GCDA, as well. So one of the major containerized space in Kochi is the small area called Perumbavoor, where I interviewed a migrant called Das. He has huge amount of land back home, but land is a burden for him. When we think land as entitlements and the major factors of production, for Das, land is a burden. So when we consider entitlements as something really that can improve the well-being of people, for some people it is actually a burden. So having land ownership does not mean that they are less deprived in an urban space. So while studies find out that migration from rural areas are greater in the poorly developed agriculture areas, it need not always mean they are particularly high among the landless agriculture laborers. So in this case, for Das, land is a burden, and this also in a way reinforces the multiple literatures which says the fact that both urban deprivation and rural distress feed each other. So the next narrative is, this is the area where the migrants are containerized or pushed into, where another migrant whom I interviewed was Ramesh. He has lots of land back home, but for him, working in urban proved really important primarily because he has to send back all the money for his kids' education as well as for irrigation purposes. So land for both of them is in a way a burden. But for one person, there is land, but the other person doesn't want land. So this is where the question of entitlements actually needs to be put into question. So the case of Ramesh is that he maximizes his savings in Kochi so that he can send it for his kids' education, water for the field, and other agricultural activities. So there is an imminent amount of containerization within the migrants is one of the major reason why we can say that they are retreating as the others in the urban space. Following that was an interesting story of Das, who had a very interesting small shop, which he could expand more and more because it was in the junction. But later, in the name of urban development, Metro came and asked him for his land, and then he was displaced without adequate resettlement. But when we say displaced without adequate resettlement, resettlement doesn't really mean that it's just the amount of the space that he has. What after being dispossessed? In the name of facelifting the cities, dispossession of Nandan's shop actually reinforces the fact that urban spaces from what it was earlier to now is fit only for elite consumption. So the question, what he asks is that, I am left with the question of what to do next. He says, luckily, I do not have any debt, but the issue is I do not have any savings either. So, Nandan again comes as the other of the urban city because Jockey showroom took over Nandan's land. One of the best ways to understand the city is through looking at the auto drivers. This particular auto driver has been going through the city for the past 50 years, and he has seen the changing place-making trajectory of the city. Interestingly, he also has a land in the heart of the city called Vaitila. However, his fortunes have not changed, though the number of occupants has increased the city. Because the minimum fare charged by the auto has changed from ₹4 to ₹30, while fuel price has increased from 24 per litre to 106 per litre. Also, with the emergence of the gig and platform workers, mostly what is happening is people just call people, the auto driver like Babu for the specific need. If you want to go from the metro to a nearby place, only then Babu's work comes, because nobody wants to stand and wait in front of the metro and book online. Rather, big rides are usually going to the Uber driver, while small rides are only what people like Babu gets. So that's, again, the intersection of the technology and, in fact, the dialectical relationship between an age-old worker who doesn't want to immerse into the technological space like Babu as compared to a very established Uber driver. The gig platform, caste also interestingly feeds into the dialectical relation of seeing an urban space, how othering happens, because Fatima, who is a UPSC aspirant, who is also a part of the gig work, gets up early in the morning of 6 o'clock, goes, and interestingly, one of the narrative which I have not put here is that a Brahmin household orders a vegetarian dish, and then Fatima goes and delivers it, and then all that they were concerned more than the food was, why don't you have a burqa? So these kind of narratives actually reinforces the fact that caste is deeply entrenched also within the labor class. And this also, in a way, reinforces the point that a critical understanding of othering cannot miss the contours of caste. And then COVID-19 also had a huge amount of dispossession. So due to the paucity of time, I just want to say that when you're talking about Kochi, you should not remember the issues of the Kochi flood, which dispossessed multiple one of my respondents was near the Alua River. He was dispossessed, and the pandemic, as soon as he was slowly recouping back, the pandemic came. So again, these are examples of othering. And finally, as Walter Benjamin says, there's an aestheticization of space which creates a figural world of urban commodity capitalism that ensures to create an economic space fit to be inhabited only by the urban elites. A native of Kochi who is working in Info Park cannot afford to stay near the place where he works, while a migrant who is elite worker from somewhere else can afford to be the delivery manager and stay near the info park. So then who belongs to the city? This again becomes a major cause of question. And to conclude, the narratives explicated here in some way or the other shows the idea of identity making and place making. And interestingly, as Ashish Nandi in one of his books concludes, as much as the city is Ashish Nandi, let me just use Ashish Nandi's very interesting ending. He just writes this, telling that Kochi shows that in many cultures, the self can be incomplete without its distinctive not selves. Indeed, it is partly defined by these not selves. So Kochi shows that kind of a urban space, and I think the othering is very much intact, which primarily proves my research question. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take questions in the end, in the interest of time. I'll move to the next panelist who's online, Raghuveer and Isha. You collectively have 12 minutes. Just keep a tab on the time in the chat.
Okay. Thank you for the invitation to present at the Urban Arc 2025. I present also on behalf of my friend Raghuveer Katpalia. Our paper is titled Engagement with Land, a renewed reading of agrarian change in India through a study of the wedding real estate nexus in Gujarat. For this paper, we focus on Ahmedabad in the western state of Gujarat in India. This work is part of a broader ongoing project based on research about agrarian studies in the Indian context. The wedding industry, by some estimates, is the fourth largest in India, and hence it represents a significant part of the Indian economy and its financial circuitry, where it facilitates the flow of surplus capital. Acknowledging the vast economic potential of the wedding industry, the Ministry of Housing has even initiated a campaign to promote India as a global destination wedding hub to draw in revenue through wedding-related tourism. Despite extensive literature on the relationship between the institution of marriage and the political economy of land, the role of the wedding industry in land transformations remains underexplored. One of the highly publicized Ambani pre-wedding events was a Samuh Vivaah, a mass wedding organized by the conglomerate for over 50 underprivileged couples as a symbolic gesture. Such Samuh Vivaahs, or what some journalists have called mass Kisan marriages, are common in Gujarat among land-poor peasants. The peasants, to circumvent incurring debt, mass marry, and as many have pointed out, is symptomatic of the ongoing agrarian crisis. On the other hand, the Ambani pre-wedding in Jamnagar, with its high-profile guest list, resembled a global finance summit akin to vibrant Gujarat. Both the Ambani wedding and mass Kisan marriages may be seen as products of India's neoliberal turn, which has furthered fiscal austerity, dismantled agrarian welfare, and strengthened government facilitation of private enterprise in sectors other than agriculture. The Sindhu Bhavan Road in Ahmedabad, a street emblematic of the city's real estate boom, with all its rising towers and big bungalows, is set to become home to one of Gujarat's largest wedding venues, an open ground called a party plot. This party plot has an estimated land cost of rupees 2,000 crores. This real estate boom, an achievement of the Gujarat model of development, has prioritized rapid urbanization, providing the agrarian elite with opportunities for capital switching, where surplus or non-performing agrarian capital and land are redirected towards speculative real estate. This real estate turn, unlike Harvey's, relies on specific urban-rural linkages to materialize and is a form of agrarian urbanism as put forth by Guru Rani. Some argue that the classical agrarian transition has mostly been bypassed in India, and what we witness instead is an incomplete transition, often framed as a tale of partial proletarianization. This tale centers the figure of the migrant worker who lives in flux with one foot in agriculture and one in the informal economy. However, this study shifts the focus toward the agrarian elite who too exist in flux between the urban and the rural, except in both realms holding positions of power. We investigate how the agrarian elites leverage their acute understanding of the agrarian context, their title of being agriculturists, and their caste location of dominance in both urban and rural settings. We find that they do this to appropriate surpluses from agrarian change. For this, we zoom in on the land monetization strategies such as transitional uses of land, which are temporary, low capital intensive uses employed by agrarian elite to capture ground rent in the process of agrarian urbanization. This enables them to offset the costs associated with holding on to land prior to selling it at a higher value. An integral part of the wedding industry, party plots represent one such significant transitional land use which we investigate. The slide here shows an example of the life cycle of a party plots from its agrarian origin to its fruition as one of the most expensive parcels of land in the city. Party plots represent large consolidated parcels of land that are easily developable and hence lucrative. We looked at party plots on the west of the river, areas witnessing a real estate boom with prices climbing as much as 290% in some areas over a span of just 5 years. Our ethnospatial analysis uses juxtapositions of various sources and forms of information regarding the spatial distribution of party plots and the caste of the people who own them. We also conducted informal interviews with 25 people related to the wedding industry, such as party plot owners, wedding decorators, wedding planners, migrant workers, florists, and builders. This helped us better understand the economic logics and labor dynamics. We created a directory of 96 party plots, aiming for a target of 100 as a random sample, and then identified the party plots using satellite imagery and cross-referenced them with town planning schemes. We then collected the survey numbers and accessed digital land revenue records, the SAT BARA form, which is the survey number form, and the node form, which is the entry detail form or form 6. We extracted owner names and classified surnames by caste and developed a scoring system to determine majority ownership by Kanbi Patidars, assigning a score of 1 if over 50% ownership by this caste was confirmed. We calculated the percentage of party plots, majority owned by Kanbi Patidars. As of now, we've been able to do this for only 30 party plots, of which about 74% are owned by Kanbi Patidar affiliated surnames. We then went on to look at the ways in which these party plots spatialized over time and the various types of party plots that exist. Many early party plots emerged within the green belt outlined in the 1965 town planning scheme. As the city expanded further westward, restrictions on agrarian land prompted landowners to monetize their properties by converting them to party plots. Notably, many of these plots remain classified as agricultural land. An interlocutor, a Mr. Patel, who is a wedding decorator and a civil contractor, shared that he initially employed labor from his native village, Bavla. His dual role as a landlord and his keen insight into the temporalities of agriculture and the wedding industry have allowed him to strategically redeploy his resources. Largely seasonal in nature, the Hindu wedding industry in Ahmedabad aligns with the Rabi winter cropping season when crops such as chickpeas, which are less labor-intensive cash crops, are grown. This alignment of agrarian cycles and wedding industries is key. We also find that many peri-urban plotting schemes use their common open plots as wedding venues or party plots. Often, even independent second homes or independent farmhouses are used as party plots. Party plots represent a lucrative way to monetize land, and hence some schemes by developers are even trying to stitch it together with their marketing strategy, where they market properties as sustainable investments by prompting the concept of time sharing, where villas are rented during the wedding season. We were informed by a local urban designer that the state also participates in land holding, waiting for the land expropriated during the town planning scheme as a part of its land-based financing strategy to mature in value. This land is then monetized as party plots. Though designated as sale for residential use, this land is leased for events with rental rates adjusted to match neighboring private party plots. This image illustrates how a landowner, a Mr. Patel, transformed a portion of his land into a residential society as a land partner while retaining the adjacent plot as a party venue, holding it as its property values increase. Kanbi patidars often become land partners, collaborating with mercantile capital rather than directly developing land. Their title as agriculturists, combined with political influence, allows them to capture the entire value chain of land commodification. They do this by becoming developers, decorators, architects, contractors, and so on. Notably, the current Gujarat Chief Minister is also a developer from the Karwa Patel community. He rose to power following the Patidar community's agitation for OBC reservation. This move was seen as an effort to appease the Karwa Kanvi Patidars and stabilize their electoral support. A preliminary word frequency analysis of the city's registry of developers shows that about 45% of registered developers are Patels. As Nikita Sood has pointed out, the Patidars exercise their political power and peasant status to both benefit from and prevent others from benefiting from agrarian land reforms. This makes them an integral part of Gujarat's land liberalization story. Ethnospatious analysis reveals the failures of agrarian land reforms in mainland Gujarat and their continuing impact on present day outcomes of urbanization and industrialization. Our findings in Gujarat reveal
Isha, you
that
have 2
dominant
minutes.
caste peasants, such as the Kanvi Patidars, commonly known as Patels, having circumvented these reforms, leverage their position of dominance in both urban and rural contexts and own the majority of party plots. We argue that the wedding industry replicates urbanized versions of the landlord-tiller relationships, facilitates the flow of black money, and contributes to the speculative economy linking agrarian, land, and urban transitions. In conclusion, we uncover the complex integration of party plots with evolving urbanization patterns and the real estate market. We examine the communities involved, both those who own and those who work on these plots, highlighting the socio-economic mobilities at play. Agrarian elites leverage their rural identity and urban influence to capture the process of agrarian urbanization. We uncover how speculative real estate practices driven by temporality foster land monetization strategies like transitional land uses and help speculators mitigate holding costs. Ultimately, we demonstrate that the agrarian elite, through their unique position in the urban rural continuum, are able to forge favorable nexuses by reconfiguring circuits of land, which are agrarian, labor, who are migrant workers, and capital, which is black money. This analysis helps up to open up new imaginaries of the constitutive role of the periphery in making the urban. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Please keep your questions. We will come back to it in the end. We'll go to the next participant who's also online, Siddhant Kumar.
Yeah, so great. So the topic that I'm presenting today is on cycle rickshaws and how the transition from cycle rickshaws to e-rickshaws has impacted the communities that are basically in the cycle rickshaw business. Mostly, I'm focusing on cycle rickshaw pullers, not the owners of cycle rickshaw businesses. But I'm using some of the statements and interviews that I did with some of the cycle rickshaw businesses in the Delhi context. So why I'm focusing on cycle rickshaws is because recently, like in December 2024, you heard that Chandni Chowk was the most cleanest and has the least AQI in all of Delhi NCT area actually, and so many articles were basically they came out and they said that this was due to restriction of heavy duty trucks as well as the creation of the non-motorized lane which is from the Red Fort to the Kabliwala Masjid. So and that has created a huge form of public awareness regarding the role of non-motorized transport in Delhi, and I thought of, and that's what motivated me to start working on it. Although this is an ongoing work, and I'm presenting it as on behalf of People's Resource Center, which is based in Delhi, and also so basically this whole cycle rickshaw sector, it's an informal sector, and it was supposed to vanish as modernization came in, but it still has persisted, and it still refuses to give up. So and currently you have, like, some of the estimates say that there are more than 100,000 rickshaws which are currently plying in Delhi, and this is just a rough estimate, which was basically um, done by some studies back in 2007 and 2012. So the numbers could be still higher, and we don't have an idea about the numbers of cycle rickshaws. So cycle rickshaws has always been on the receiving end of Delhi's public policy and public policy debates, as well as local government, because so in the 1960s the MCT came up with a bylaw which capped the numbers of cycle rickshaws, which has to be at 60,000, and that really created a huge rent seeking system and the bribe system, where the local MCT as well as the police were involved in seeking out rents from cycle rickshaw pullers as well as the cycle rickshaw business owners. So so a lot of, like, NGOs and the cycle rickshaw business owners approached the Delhi High Court, and they basically asked the High Court to intervene in this case, and the High Court basically overruled the MCT law of 1960s. And the High Court said that it is against the right to a dignified livelihood, that you can't just restrict a mode of transport which is considered colonial or something which is very backward. So after that ruling, a lot of I think MCT actually went to Supreme Court to get to basically overrule the Delhi High Court decision. But then the Supreme Court said that if there is no capping on any other number of vehicles, like, let's say, cars or motorcycles in Delhi, so why do you want to put a cap on cycle rickshaws? So yeah, and presently the cycle rickshaws are apart from being human pooled, they also have been retrofitted as battery fitted scooter rickshaws. So this is like the broader context where where I wanted to analyze the impact of transition from cycle rickshaws to e-rickshaws on the cycle rickshaw communities. So e-rickshaw has been a very highly successful mode of transport in Delhi in terms of last mile connectivity, and and there is no capping on the number of e-rickshaws. So it has like totally outgrown and basically taken the space which cycle rickshaw used to have, and also like the public Gramin Sevas. So so why that is so? Because I mean, there are two reasons that I found like through my interviews, that the e-rickshaw basically favors migrant population, and there are several number of migrant population which are coming inside the city, and it becomes a very good source of income for migrant population. And also the labor productivity is higher in e-rickshaws in comparison to cycle rickshaws. So to understand the impact on the cycle rickshaw communities of this transition and the huge number of growth of e-rickshaws, I went and talked to the cycle rickshaw pullers and the business owners of Chandni Chowk and Lajpat Nagar. So I chose these two areas because these are high density and they have high footfall. They also have protected lanes for cycle rickshaws, which basically promotes their growth, and basically protects them from motorized vehicles. So in Chandni Chowk, there are around 4,000 cycle rickshaws alone, uh, while most of them are unlicensed. Only 400 are licensed. Cycle rickshaws are also not allowed to ply on arterial roads, which is basically the ring roads in Delhi. And so one of the limitations that I faced during my interviews was so most of the cycle rickshaws are always on the move, and it makes it difficult to talk to them for a long-term engagement. So that was one of the major difficulties that I faced during my study. So there are certain findings that I came across through my interviews that so you have so the number of rickshaws that are
Siddhant, you
plying
have
in
5 minutes.
Sure. So the number of rickshaws which are plying in cycle rickshaws are mostly unlicensed, and that creates a huge problem, which are much more similar to the pre Delhi High Court ruling problems that the cycle rickshaw used to face, which is the bribe system and the rent-seeking behavior from the police and the MCD. So when I was talking to the cycle rickshaw pullers in Chandni Chowk, there were so many rickshaw pullers who complained that they have to pay $100 for the rent and 20 extra for the bribe to their business owner. So that creates a huge system. I've already been reiterated that the older problems have come up anew, even within the protected lanes. And they're also facing another competition from the retrofitted cycle rickshaw, which is mostly in a scooter form. So they also come in within the Chandni Chowk lane, and they have to basically face a competition from them because they are faster and they don't require human labor. In the Lajpat Nagar area, most of the cycle rickshaws that I talked to were migrants from Bihar, and so the problems that Chandni Chowk rickshawala has are much more different from what Lajpat Nagar rickshawalas have. So they are mostly individual owners. They have their own cycle rickshaws, and their income is steadier than the cycle rickshaw owners of Chandni Chowk. So that, I mean, I wanted to look at Lajpat Nagar because it also has protected lanes, but then it's not just non-motorized lane, but other transport vehicles are also allowed to ply on the same lane. So what does it mean for just transition? So just transition came during the whole workers movement against phasing out of polluting industries and the fossil fuel industries. So the cycle rickshaw transition, the transition from cycle rickshaw to e-rickshaw has also been considered as one of the unjust transition, and it has become it has become a huge problem for cycle rickshaws to basically compete with e-rickshaws, which are brought in the whole context of just transition. And in India, you don't have that in the name of just transition, you have mostly mostly the communities are not provided remedies, and they're just given certain guard jobs and education. And mostly in transport sector also, you don't see just transition happening. So what could be done to, and what are the broader lessons of this study? So basically, the regulations on cycle rickshaws are still arbitrary, and cycle rickshaws, which which in the pre-2010 era had certain problems, are still resurfacing again. And for a just transition, you need NMT lanes, which are protected from motorized transport. And one also has to consider the role of a clean mode of transport, like cycle rickshaw being a clean mode of transport, and calling it as a green informal services, which some of the literature has tried to do. And lastly, I wanted to show some of the PRC work that has been done on NMT design and advocacy. This we have been doing in Gaya, and we are also currently doing it in Delhi. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Siddhant. Our next panelist is here. Ranjini, over to you.
Thanks. So hi everyone, my name is Ranjini and I'm a PhD student in urban planning at Columbia University. And this talk is entitled The Right to a City, Rethinking Welfare Capitalism Through Urban Rights. This paper is a work in progress, so any feedback would be appreciated. So on June 4th, 2017, an array of labor unions in the Kolar goldfields, a small town in Karnataka, went on strike in solidarity with the Bharat Earth Movers Limited, or BEML, workforce, a local branch of a PSU which falls under the Indian Ministry of Defense. This was organized by left-leaning trade unions in opposition to the BJP-led union government, which had basically proposed the privatization of this public firm, which is BIML. While the heavy involvement of communist trade unions was to be expected, the support lent by the local BJP chapter in KGF to the agitation was a fair indicator of the level of public anger at the prospect of privatizing what people saw as the last vestige of state interest in the district. Regardless of ideology, no political organization in KGF could hope for survival without making at least a cursory show of support for the proceedings. So opposition to the privatization of BEML within Kolar is not unusual or unique to the region. Instead, it represents one instance of a more significant battle being waged across the subcontinent over the future of public firms. Across the board, restructuring has had an adverse impact on jobs, with formalized employment giving way to increased contractualization of labor. Further, with these reforms have sort of coincided with a period of profound structural unemployment across India's hinterlands. So, so in this paper, I'm basically arguing that the protests at KGF, against privatization, sort of connect struggles around labor to questions on urban rights. Just sort of referring to Lefebvre's 1968, The Right to the City, I sort of ask, what do struggles around urban rights look like beyond the southern metropolis? And second, I sort of try and touch on, in the short time that we have, what struggles for urban rights in southern geographies add to the right to the city framework? Or how can rethinking what constitutes a city in southern geographies broaden our ontological understanding of a city space itself? This is mainly because in this paper I sort of think about, I try and think beyond the sort of hegemonic idea of the metropolis, right, the southern metropolis, and to kind of look at spaces that have been conceptualized as and acted as city spaces much before globalization. So in this paper, basically, I'm focusing on smaller urban agglomerations like Kolar Goldfields, which you can see over here in yellow, which hosts public firms and continues to sort of benefit from peripheral Fordism decades after the rollback of the welfare state, and has sort of acted as an urban space or been conceptualized as a city space historically, even though it doesn't really feature in sort of right to the city frameworks now. So to kind of understand this or get into this history, we have to kind of think about the Indian public firm and think about the kind of purposes which it was sort of imbued with from the very beginning. For example, from their inception, Indian public firms were tasked with a dual purpose. The first, of course, was to form the backbone of a protectionist yet comprehensive industrial sector, which we all know about. But the second, which is the public firm, was seen as a driver for urbanization in rural areas and backward districts, providing a pathway from agriculture into non-farm employment. So as you can see over here, is this the pointer? Yeah, so if you can see over here, you sort of have the urban core of KGF, which is the larger province, sort of formed by what is Kolar Goldfields proper or Robertson Pit, has two public firms, the defunct BGML or Bharat Gold Mines Limited, and BEML, which I was speaking about earlier, which is slated for privatization. And through the public firms in KGF, we can kind of think of the differentiated history of these kinds of PSUs in India and how they've sort of become intertwined with larger debates around urbanization and urban rights. So if we start from the very beginning, you have Bharat Gold Mines Limited here, which is the oldest public firm in the region and was formed with the nationalization of a colonial gold mining block and was the origin point for urbanization in a largely rural Kolar district. And this sort of happens in the late 1800s. So KGF is just one in a wave of new industrial towns established under colonial rule at the turn of the 19th century. And these new towns and their related urbanization form the bedrock of a colonial state building and territorial control. You also have now the sort of melding together of urban governance, industry, and labor, right? So you have these new industrial towns, which you can think of KGF in particular, which sort of coincides with these far-reaching changes in the agrarian hinterlands. You have widespread rural distress at the end of the 19th century. You have repeated famines in the agrarian countryside, and this sort of increases migration from sort of rural to urban migration into older cities and these new towns that are sort of emerging. And within the specific structure of the colonial company town, you have labor issues that sort of become inseparable from those of urban governance. So for example, you have KGF. In KGF, the colonial corporation assumes administrative powers over the larger mining region, governing it like a parastatal. You also have the arrival of tens of thousands of dispossessed workers from these agrarian hinterlands, which kind of prompts employers that are overseeing these townships to kind of undertake town planning. So you have a sort of melding together of like urban governance and labor. Employers are taking on sanitation, education, health, workers' welfare, and other functions of urban governance. So you have the company assuming the role of both employer and town administrator. And labor actions which are sort of occurring are often centered around both demands ranging from, let's say, the workers' rights to better urban services. Meanwhile, you have workers' movements that are also happening in tandem in these new towns. They sort of become hotbeds of what is like a nascent labor movement. And they take on this distinct anti-caste tenor, given the sort of Dalit majority in these industrial towns. And this is mainly because there is a proletarianization of agrarian labor, which allows native feudal social relations like caste to be encoded into an emergent capitalist class formation, where the most dangerous and predatory forms of labor are sort of, like mining, which become the preserve of landless Dalit laborers. So, so close to 3/4 of the workers in the mines in BGML, which, these mines which eventually become BGML, are Dalits. And for the first time, Dalit workers are a political majority here, and they sort of dominate the local workforce. And they sort of wield considerable power over the industrial town through labor action and as residents. So there's again, sort of an intersection of labor, the public firm, urban governance, and caste. So on nationalization, the post-independent Indian state inherits this colonial industry in its contiguous township, basically all these relationships, right? The workers' quarters, the governance apparatus, and these formative linkages between industrialization, subaltern politics, and urban rights. And under the first and second 5-year plans, the state sort of upgrades these worker housings, constructs new tenements, and sort of builds out this into almost like a city. And most importantly, you have the third 5-year plan, which sort of explicitly communicates the intent of urban growth in these small towns and sort of, thinking of them as alternative city spaces other than the metropolis. And sort of geared towards regional planning, the third, FYP aims at achieving balanced urban growth and sort of developing these intermediate and secondary cities, especially in underdeveloped areas. So you have Bimal, which I kind of opened with, which is allocated to KGF to absorb labor in the eventuality of resource decline. So, you have urban industrial towns in general, and KGF in particular, which become sort of meeting points for a constellation of claims around labor and caste. And this is made possible through establishing public firms and their related mode of urbanization. So, for example, by the 1980s, you have these two, SOEs in this region. They constitute the region's largest non-farm employers, with land assets jointly comprising 15,000 acres. And subsequent state master plans for two industrial townships have effectively sort of shaped the outlay of the urban core of this region. And they contain worker housing, parks, schools, hospitals, sports and community centers, markets, and transportation facilities, basically a wide range of facilities that you wouldn't find in other urban towns. And obviously, through affirmative quota, you have these units also overwhelmingly employing both Dalit and OBC or Vokaliga, specifically Vokaliga, workers from Kalyana, Karnataka, and other rural districts. So you have a sort of generational mobility that's taking place in these regions. So, given this history and the protest against public sector privatization, we must read these protests, as sort of a claim for urban rights. Because as you see that as sort of labor privatization occurs, you have, and let's say BGML has been closed, you see almost 30,000 workers commuting every day from KGF to Bangalore, and sort of the historical emplacement of these people is being threatened. And you also see that the sort of inherited governance structures, urban governance structures that allowed for industry to assume administrative responsibilities over the town and simultaneously has simultaneously sort of curbed the efficacy of elected officials. So this indicates basically a double movement. On one hand, establishing the industrial town has been crucial to new forms of urban emplacement, and on the other hand, it means the town's trajectory is largely tied to the industry's fate. This has only deepened efforts to fight for what locals call the right to a city, where emplacement has become a central tenet in the local community's claims around urban rights. So to sort of conclude here, so many of these old strongholds of labor activism have been swept up in re-territorialization. And they are no longer sort of self-sustaining enclaves in their own rights. And these regions, like KGF, have sort of, as you kind of saw, have been reduced to hinterlands to select valorized nodes of the economy, like Bangalore. So I argue that in the face of this global re-territorialization, which seeks to detach land from labor, it becomes even more imperative that urban theory seeks to reforge links between the core and the periphery, and city and the hinterlands to foreground arenas of struggle that remain obscured by capital's invisibilization of multiscalar urban relationalities. While Fordism has run out of steam materially and discursively, the symbolic continuities in state-labor relations within the public sector, especially public firms, continues to provide a bulwark to the incursions of capital. So if we can think about, let's say, development policies in India and the way it's sort of changed over time, all planning interventions, though, have a sort of a level of path dependency, even though these larger shifts are sort of occurring. So we can think about, the right to the city movement over here sort of being a sort of unintended outcome of these sort of path dependencies. But I'll stop here for now. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Now we move on to the last panelist, Chitra.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for being present here for the last panel and the last panelist. I work with Indus Action, but this is an extension of the research that I independently do as well. So it's a work in progress, but and which is why I would also appreciate if people can give in their comments, questions, etc. So when we look at migration in the international context, there's a definite global north divide, despite the fact that almost 40% of the migration takes place within the global south. This is also, the statistic is also important because even within that 40% of migration, almost 80% of it takes place alongside contiguous borders. But then we also understand the global south as parts of global south that have borders as colonial demarcations. So how do we then understand migration in a geography where borders or nation states themselves have been colonially imposed. I take the specific example of Uttarakhand, India, and Sudur Paschim Nepal. The boundary is actually the river that once united these both regions. This is the Mahakali River. Yeah, so for a long time, for centuries actually, people from now Sudur Paschim have been migrating to hill towns of now Uttarakhand. So say for example Pithoragarh, Darchula, Almora, Nainital, etc. And yet despite the fact that the central and central western Himalayas have been a continuum of people, almost a continuous geography, you still have these differentiations among ethnic populations. My idea is what happens when we understand nation states themselves as colonial impositions. Then in that sense, how do we then understand borders as agents of openness, agents of difference despite their openness? So the conceptual framework that I follow here is of methodological nationalism. First is that nation states are an arrangement of political modernity. The other is because of this arrangement of individuals, they are considered natural to any sociological inquiry. In addition to that, nation states are not created in episodic ways, but also in banal, very everyday ways without us even realizing it. Similarly, migration studies is mired by methodological nationalism, either by ignoring the nation states as the background or not problematizing the idea of nation states, which I intend to do or try to do through this. And then finally, through territorial limitation, where demographies constructed, say, through censuses are taken as a given, and trans-border processes are almost always ignored, though almost always, yeah. So when we look at the narratives of migration in the hills, there's always a focus on, or Indian and Nepali become overbearing signifiers, and somehow the colonization of Kumaon Garhwal and Doti by British and the Gurkha are pushed to the background. So I intend to take a particular case of an ethnicity, which is the Khas, which the Khas is an ethnonym for a group of people that inhabit the central and central western Himalayas, and try to move, what happens when we don't look at the nation states as categories of people. So the first thing that I look at is census categorization, which means how the ethnicity has been created, created or has undergone changes through the census processes. Then I understand bordering, ordering, and othering as a collective continuous process to make a point that, again, borders are not static boundaries, but also processes. So border as a process that is made instead of something that is demarcated. Finally, migrantization of the Khas, where I look at how even within the same ethnicity, racialization can occur due to different processes. So this is one of the interesting cases, because the first, I think, pan-India census was conducted in the early 1980s, but the census of the northwestern provinces was actually can be considered a prototype for the pan-India census. So here you can see that you have Khasiya or the Hill Rajputs as a separate category, which is also reflected in 1972, but for Garhwal. Finally, in 1921, the Khasiya or the Khas was subsumed within the category of the Kshatriya. So the Khasiya did not exist as a category. Subsequently, leading to some kind of an archival silence, where populations that have been have recognized themselves as distinct have been subsumed within the larger categories of nation building. This was also a part of it, and L.D. Joshi explores some part of it in his book as well, is to create them as administrative categories. In the Khas family law, he also looks at how the customary laws of the Khas were then broken down to be justified to be included under the Mitakshara law. Then again, one part of it is alienation of the people from themselves. The other is the continuous processes of surveying, where I've specifically taken Pandit Nain Singh Rawat, and Pandit here means surveyor. So surveyor Nain Singh Rawat, who was considered by the British as ethnically close enough to survey Lhasa and Kathmandu, but then at the same time was a subject of the British in his endeavor. So the bordering and the mapping of the territories were not just done by the geographical surveys, but also through the Treaty of Sigoli, where Kumaon and Garhwal were handed over to the British. By ordering, so one thing the British intended to do was to bring the peripheries closer to the center. And that was done through an extensive roadways and railroad networks, where connections to Tibet. I mean, it was dual in the sense wanted to understand to understand the territory of Tibet as well, but also to draw the borderland populations closer to the closer to the center. The other is, finally, it's othering, which means that because of this movement inwards, there were newer ways of belonging that people could understand. So the dichotomy was then between the backward Pahadi versus Maidani person. Again, in the narratives, and this also I'm trying to explore, even in the Himalayan Gazetteer, if you look at it, migration from then Gorkha Kingdom or Sudur Paschim region was then understood as influx from Western, quote unquote, Western Nepal. So people who were migrating from, say, the Doti Principality or the Doti Kingdom were treated as, in narrations, as migrants from Western Nepal. Oh, I can't, it's not working. Okay. Finally, what I want to explore a bit of it and how the period of colonization of Sudur Paschim was a period of retrogression, because Sudur Paschim was treated as a buffer region between the British East India Company and the kingdom of and the Gorkha Kingdom. Newer ways alongside newer ways of relating with the banning of the Kuli Begar Pratha in Kumaon especially, the informal economy, which is still overwhelmingly Nepalese, the informal economy of Uttarakhand was, or the informal work in Uttarakhand, especially of coolies, porters, etc., was being taken up by the people who were fleeing the taxation regime from the Gurkha kingdom. I would also, so this is a very interesting concept, ethnic racialization, which Hugh studies in terms of North Korean migrants in South Korea, where she looks at how technically it's the same ethnicity, but because of linguistic differences, because of the differences in the occupations that they have taken up, or North Koreans take up, the ethnicity, which I mean, a single ethnicity has been racialized in terms of the skill sets and labor, the kind of industry that they are involved in. So it's not a conclusion because it's still an open question, but then it's first of all to understand borders, because we have looked at borders even within, say, the global south or Southeast Asia in terms of securitization. But what happens when you have an open border, quote unquote, when you have a friendly border? How are differences created there still? and how these differences are a part of a colonial legacy, are a part of structural administrative restructuring of a population, involving territorialization, involving categorization, also involving mobility and the kind of occupation that is taken up by individuals. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. As I promised, that was a really interesting set of presentations. We are also perhaps a good panel because we finished right on time. We have enough time for questions and for a discussion. The broad themes that we covered in this panel actually ranged from migration to land to transport and urban rights. I just wanted to sort of start off with a few questions for everybody, and then we can open it up to the audience as well. Shankar, both in your case and in Chitra's case, you both are talking about migration in very different contexts. But if you could collectively reflect a little bit about, you said urban deprivation and rural distress sort of went hand in hand, and you said there was sort of racialization of the migrants. If you could reflect a little bit upon on what is the experience of the migrants when they think about the place where they are coming to? Because you specifically talked about both sort of within the state as well as outsiders, right? So when you're using the word the otherness, you didn't go right up to that point where you said what did the migrant themselves think about it, though you walked us to the point of that construction. So if you could reflect a little bit about that, and if there was anything that you had in a similar line, thinking about what this otherness looked like from the perspective of the migrant themselves. So if we could get started with that, then I'll go to the other panelists.
So I would like to take up the issue of COVID-19 in particular, to take the story forward of a migrant called Das. So when the natives completely sidelined the containerized space of the migrants, primarily because they were always on the roads and they believed that they are primarily the people who discharged the COVID-19 virus. So then they again came as a community there, and he started selling extra commodities such as rice, and only people from his own communities went there. So while they themselves do not realize they have been othered, in a way, they retreat for themselves. So they don't realize, as I ended my presentation, their distinctive North selves is not understood in the larger urban framework of Kochi. So, and this is again reflected in terms of their wages. A migrant worker, and the larger notion is they are called as guest workers, which literally translates in Malayalam to Adhiti Thoilali, which basically means there is already an otherization there. You do not belong here. As Chitra also was telling, the kind of imagination of a boundary is already there. So I think that would be my answer.
Briefly tell us a little bit more, because you used the word containerized space a couple of times, so a little bit on that.
Though migrants go to the center of the city, work for everybody, one of the house resident, he says he goes from Perumbavoor and goes to the place which is the core of the city, which is Panamballi Nagar or Vaitila. But he is not staying there. He again has to go back to the containerized space where he is. So all the Bengalis, irrespective of not being from Bengal, be it from Assam or Bihar or anywhere, they are called as Bengalis. They come to the core of the city, work, go back to the picture that I had showed in the PPT. So basically reinforces the fact that they are pushed into a particular space, containerized. Yeah.
Yes, what I discussed, the otherization is more like a colonial process that percolates into the present as well. The very material implications of this otherization is, in whatever ways that we can think about migrants. So there is no access to healthcare. Identity is an issue. Housing is a big issue with especially Nepalese migrants. Or migrants from across the border, I would say. Again, inclusion in social protection as well. So yeah, I still remember, I think that this incident might even spell out how the issue is because when a friend of mine, and this was for another research that we were doing with Nepalese migrants, just asking them questions about coverage on social protection, etc. The person actually gave us a Nepali rupee note, 5 rupee note, saying that we have never had anyone come to us and ask about how we were doing. So, you know, it's absolute alienation and otherization, which translates into very material terms for the migrants in Uttarakhand. And also, because they make a major part of the informal economy still as porters, as coolies, right? So on account of the nature of their occupation as well, they do not have that kind of job security. And then on account of nationality, they don't have social protection.
Ranjini, I was also thinking, I mean, just to continue with that metaphor of containerized space, because you were talking about how 30,000 workers from Kolar come to Bangalore every day, and the container literally carries them in some sense to the city. A little bit about, you know, if I don't know if you've already explored this in your research, but for the future generations, this idea of labor and caste that you talked about, what does that look like currently? Has it dissipated with sort of the mobility and movement towards the city? And what does it hold for the unions that are currently, you know, still there in this in KGF?
Yeah, I kind of have looked at that in another sort of piece that I'm writing, but I think there's sort of a generational dissipation of caste and labor identities. So if you think generationally, if you think of the forefathers of, or the, let's say, grandfather or father, because it's a very masculine sort of also labor region, they were all unionized. And now you have all the sort of young kids who, you know, they're well educated. Let's say their fathers were just a 4th grade pass. Now these guys have like a master's degree, but there are not enough jobs. So they're sort of working, let's say, in sort of gig work. So there is a sort of, you know, a generational issue that's facing the labor union from the perspective of labor. But caste-wise, I think the KGF Taluk has been redrawn several times after delimitation. So the sort of original reserved constituency outlines have now sort of been, they've kind of included rural areas into the sort of urban boundary. So even though those surrounding regions are rural and Dalit majority, they are all Kannadiga. So, you know, it also means like there's a very specific history to the Tamil Dalits who live in KGF. So in a way, the sort of caste solidarity struggles have also been highly diluted.
Yeah, thank you for that. Isha and Raghuveer, I had a question for you, but it's very similar to the one online, and I see you've already responded to it. But for the benefit of the audience here, I was also curious what happens to these party plots through the year, because as I understand in Ahmedabad, the wedding season is also quite short. So if you could just, it's a long question, but I'm just going to let one of you respond to it. And also to just finish the question, does it sort of enable us to think of more public spaces which are totally absent in the city? And how does one imagine these party plots when they're so privatized, or so in the sense like, you know, capture of the elite in some sense?
Yeah, so right now for like about 9 months, they lie vacant and they're not. Yeah, but there is merit to thinking of like how they can be sort of repurposed for other sort of more public uses that are there. Currently, that's not happening. Yeah, but there is definitely merit to thinking of that, right? And there's a shortage of open space in Ahmedabad. There's that WHO statistic that I shared, and at 9 square meters, we have 1.3 square meters. And yeah, definitely, there's no sort of tax for vacancy here or nothing like that. So it means, I don't think that would be, I don't know if that would work, but they have it like in San Francisco and all that, you have vacancy tax. So that allows for some form of redistribution. But nothing here at the moment. There are projects speculative projects that they have done. I had done one. If someone's interested, I can share with them of how to repurpose these.
Okay, thank you. Siddhant, my last question is to you. You are talking, one of the statements you made was that these rickshaws favor the migrant populations in the city. Can you just tell us a little bit more? And I'm trying to see how that connects to what Shankar was talking about, migrants who are in Kochi and their sort of mobility within the city there.
So basically, that statement was made in the background of the rental market on cycle rickshaws as well as e-rickshaws. So the rental market basically favors migrant population. So in my interviews, like with the cycle rickshaw business owners, most of them told me that they hire migrants because they are much more easier to get, and also they are dispensable. So they don't hire locals for the business, for the cycle rickshaw pulling. So that's one reason. But there's a very interesting paper by Asima Sood on this, that the connection between the migration, and how it basically how the cycle rickshaw market favors migrants. So if someone is interested, then they can look at it. And my argument comes from that paper also, and I substantiated it with the interviews that I did with the cycle rickshaw business owners. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we are open to questions from the audience, if there are any.
My question goes to Ranjani about, I wanted to know, when you talk about the Kolar gold field, in terms of migration, you do see that much of the migration historically had come from the Madras presidency. And then in the post-independent, you do have the migration from the rural parts of Karnataka. And because of it, the religious demography is very interesting there, because you do see a lot of Tamil Christian, you do see the influence of Adi Dravidas and Adi Kannadigas, and then you do see a significant proportion of Christians, because you have Christian missionaries who are also, and you do see elements of a lot of literature from what I've read from Janki Nair talks about satanic practices that also happens within the factories, which is much to do with lower caste religious practices of lower deities, which lies outside the orthodox or dominant Hindu traditions. So could you elaborate more on how do these various religious identities function within the Kolar, or if you have worked on this throughout, even historically or even in the current times?
No, just go ahead.
So yeah, I've not really, that's not been my great focus of study, though of course if you go there and I've been doing fieldwork there since 2017. So I've seen I know vaguely the religious politics that are sort of happening on the ground, though that's not been my focus of study. I think what's interesting, which I have noticed, is kind of how many of these religious identities have been translated into actual labor politics or politics as such. So you do have a sort of, the RPI, Republican Party of India, which is heavily Buddhist dominated, versus the Communist Party. And both of these that sort of claim to represent the Dalit workers there, largely. There isn't much differentiation, or historically there has not been much differentiation between, let's say, the Adi Dravidars and the Adi Kannadigas. But it kind of speaks to, this sort of very conflicted and contesting understandings of caste and labor, or the Dalit worker himself. Are they really is worker and labor the meta category that they sort of are affiliated to and best represents their condition, or does the condition of Dalitness within that labor stratification actually best describe their condition? So that has been sort of an enduring struggle that's been happening for a very long time. Though I do have to say it's kind of been diluted more recently with this sort of neoliberal sort of deindustrialized space which KGF has become. It's that sort of historical kind of struggle has been diluted, if that I answer that questions in some way.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Hi, thank you for the sorry. Thanks for all the wonderful presentations. My question is to Sankar. I really loved the way that we had these deep, rich questions, deep, rich accounts from the different migrants who came to the city. And maybe it's because you started to talk about food delivery, I started to think about, are there some non-material, maybe more bodily or other ways in which people are othered in the city? And I just know from speaking to people who migrate from one part of India to another, I'm always shocked as a non-Indian how much people talk about food as one of the ways in which they feel othered in their new home city. And I'm wondering whether that came up in any of the interviews, especially from the migrants who come from further away. Did they talk about, basically, because it's something bodily and really felt, did that come up at all in the interviews, how people felt othered in their alien home?
Thanks for bringing food, but that was not really a question for my respondents, but I actually consider that as my side business, research on food. And I look into the revolution of pasta. So I've written something in the Economic and Political Weekly, and I call that perfective fakeness, which basically means that pasta is something that you can get in a normal commercial store, but when it is served in a cafe, it becomes accessible to a very limited few. I mean, very, very few people, not an informal laborer, perhaps not even the person who's delivering the pasta back home, like Fatima. I think I would probably stop there. Yeah, but it's perfectly fakeness. That's my idea.
Any other questions in the audience? Okay, one there.
It's again for you, Shankar. Like, I remember having a conversation with a IS officer almost like 4 or 5 years back. Had the same question when I was studying on rental housing for the migrant construction industry workers over there. Had the same doubt that you have, like why treat them as a guest? And then that IS officer he supported himself, telling that like the connection between the Gulf, like how they also treat them as guests and like send them back. And over here, he also added one more point, telling that like most of the migrants who come over here, they also don't identify themselves as local, in the sense their definition was they don't have any local identity card. So neither Aadhaar or voter ID or something. And then he, got this thing of like how this now the parliament seat sharing thing and all happened. When the migrants are not helping our state, that is one of the reasons we are treating them as guests. But he also supported that we are the only state which prominently talking about them and like giving them some identity, helping out them with some industrial workers housing and others. So that's where I felt a flat. I was arguing, but suddenly I was like, okay, you're sounding it really good, but it's not good. But I have no other, because like there is no other comparison in India. It was like, technically the new what it's called, the constitution, the seats wala thing, Kerala is the only state which did not grow even one single seat, and UP has been doubled or tripled. So like he had also kept it such a nice way. So I don't know, I want to hear from you. Is that IS officer, I don't want to take out his name, but like his argument sounded good. Yeah, I'll stop over here.
Thanks, Sai, for that comment. Just one of the respondents, when the COVID-19 came, I think perhaps Kerala was the only state which allowed them to get, access to food grains. So, despite terming them as guest workers, despite retreating as others, but still they had access to basic necessities such as food. But then one of the major issue was, as you pointed out, while interviewing one of the local trade union members, they didn't allow me to record their voices because they were scared. But migrants were always free to say. Yeah, maybe we can discuss more later. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much. Thanks everyone for staying on.